Hello everybody, thanks for tuning in. My name's Jennifer Harris and today I'm going to talk about the findings of a research project I've been working on with some colleagues at the University of Bristol, which looks at compliance and enforcement practices in the UK private rented sector. So as no doubt many of you are aware, the sector has changed and grown significantly in recent years, and poor property conditions within the sector is now one of the most important housing issues facing the UK today. In response to these challenges, there's been a significant amount of recent change in regulation of the sector, and UK local authorities now have a broad range of powers to improve standards. However, there's been a widespread criticism about variation and inadequacy in current enforcement practices. These statistics show that many local authorities in England have not commenced any prosecutions or made use of the new civil penalty powers, and similar criticisms have been made of local authorities across the UK. There is, however, a tendency within the sector to confuse outputs with outcomes. So you'll see statistics such as these mentioned in reports and interpreted as demonstrating the ineffectiveness of selective licensing or another form of regulation. But the goal of regulation is not to achieve prosecutions, but within this context, to improve standards by achieving compliance. So the question then becomes, what drives compliance? Why do landlords comply with the law or not? And these questions have important practical implications. So if we have a very narrow understanding of what shapes behaviour, then this could lead to ineffective policy responses. One of the more comprehensive explorations of the drivers of compliance has been offered by Parker and Nielsen, who framed the discussion around 14 factors. These are focused not only on the characteristics of formal regulation, so those related to deterrence, but they see compliance is shaped by a much broader range of factors, including a range of economic, social, and normative motives. So, for example, if the regulation is seen to be acceptable, or if the target population has the knowledge or capacity to comply. So this framework encourages us to think of compliance on regulation in much broader terms than only formal enforcement, which is where much of the discussion in the PRS has been focused. Much regulatory activity still adopts a sort of command or control or deterrence-focused style of enforcement. This involves setting rules, monitoring adherence to those rules, and applying sanctions where appropriate. This approach has been subject to a number of criticisms within the literature, partly because it lacks nuance and doesn't take account of the varied activities of officers that are on the ground. So a number of alternatives have been proposed. This includes decentered regulation, which embraces processes of self-regulation and asks us to consider sort of what other mechanisms and what other actors other than the state could be responsible for regulation and help to achieve behavioural change. Risk-based regulation is often a database strategy, and this involves focusing resources on particular areas of concern. And perhaps the most well-known alternative is responsive regulation, which is based upon the idea of a pyramid of enforcement. So the idea behind the pyramid of enforcement is that the bulk of regulatory activity should take place around the base of the pyramid, which comprises mainly informal activity, persuasion, advice, information, and so forth. And the response is then escalated if compliance is not forthcoming. So much regulatory developments within the sector can be seen as sort of adding tiers onto this enforcement pyramid. However, we don't know much about how different strategies are adopted on the ground and what shapes the various approaches which local authorities adopt. So yes, of course, a lack of resources is going to impose constraints, but it doesn't explain why some local authorities report much higher levels of informal enforcement than others. So our research project aimed to investigate how UK local authorities are developing strategies to improve their sector and to provide suggestions for how regulation and enforcement in the sector could be improved. We went about answering these questions and meeting that aim by carrying out a series of stakeholder interviews with landlord and tenant groups, which included some representatives from Rent Smart Wales, which is the main regulatory body for the national system of registration and licensing they have in place in Wales. And we visited 13 local authorities across the UK, spoke to a wide range of different participants, both those working at strategic level and those responsible for enforcing regulation on the ground. And whilst, of course, each UK jurisdiction has its own approach to regulating the sector, and we do explore this within the full report. There are certain practicalities associated with enforcement that are relevant to any kind of environmental regulation. So whether or not there's a written enforcement strategy in place, the choices will have to be made about the frequency of inspections, who to target, which tools to prioritize, how much effort do we give to formal or informal activity, how much effort do we put into regulating the sector relative to other areas of activity. And findings from our case study suggest there are at least 4 types of strategies operating within the sector. We identified local authorities adopting what we've termed a light touch approach. These are local authorities that focus predominantly on informal activity. They seek to achieve compliance through advice and persuasion and information. It wasn't clear that the response would usually be escalated if compliance was not forthcoming. Very limited use of formal powers, mainly reactive, little effort to carry out inspections or to initiate inspections or to identify non-compliance, and limited what we're terming compliance-focused activities. So these are sort of advisory services, online information, accreditation schemes, landlord forums, landlord days, these sorts of kind of sector-wide compliance-based initiatives, largely absent from within these local authorities. And the little effort that was awarded to identifying non-compliance appeared to be occurring despite recognition that there was sort of some intentional non-compliant behaviour occurring. So this is demonstrated within this slide. This participant says we're aware that landlords have a reputation for having substandard properties do operate in our area. We could identify and go and check up on them. We don't have a strategy or policy for doing that. We just sort of turn a blind eye. A lack of a strategic approach was common in these local authorities. Little attention given to aims or outcomes or objectives. And our research identified the different sort of drivers or reasons why local authorities might adopt a light touch approach. So there was a lack of resources. This was cited as a problem across the case studies, not just in relation to money, but also in relation to sort of the skills and capacities of staff that were available. It was a low political area locally. There was little focus given to aims and outcomes, as I've mentioned. They tended to be quite large rural areas, so carrying out inspections or delivering compliance-focused activities across large geographically dispersed areas posed further challenges. There tended to be poor internal organisation. So 2 Scottish local authorities that fell within this category, the landlord registration function sat outside of the housing team, sat with other licensing activities, and there was evidence this led to sort of inefficiency, lack of communication, lack of clarity about delegation of roles and responsibilities. There was concerns within these areas of the negative impact of regulation within the local authority and among councillors about the impact on supply, the impact of landlord behaviour. And there was a feeling that there was sort of less intentional criminal activity than in perhaps larger urban areas, and most non-compliance was due to inadvertence, was not intentional. The evidence from the case studies suggests that an exclusive reliance on informal activity without possible escalation is highly unlikely to be effective. And likely to be exploited by a small minority of landlords. As this one housing officer in Scotland told us, they felt that certain landlords had twigged on that action wasn't coming and just continued regardless. Partly due to the limitations thought to be associated with the light touch approaches, our evidence suggests that some local authorities are moving towards more hardline approaches, which places sort of most focus on formal activity. So there was a high number of prosecutions and civil penalties within this local authority. There was officially no informal approach, although this was sometimes adopted on the ground by officers because of other kind of risks or pressures. So, for example, the risk of homelessness to the tenant. Nonetheless, it wasn't part of the strategic approach. There was little attention given to compliance-focused activities. And within these areas, sort of the PRS was a political priority. So there was local councillors, landlord and tenant groups advocating quite strongly for a sort of tough enforcement regime. Large urban areas, there was a feeling there was high levels of intentional criminality. So the formal activity was necessary in order to deter this activity, and prosecutions were seen as a sign of success, so a sign of a job well done, and that's how the high number of prosecutions were often relayed to me in the interviews. And there was very much a focus in these local authorities on the highest level of risk. The views on the potential side effects of regulation contrasted sharply to those adopted by Lighttouch authorities. So as this participant told us, you'll see landlords exiting the market. If you take this more robust approach, let them exit the market. Let's get rid of the people that can't manage their properties. So whilst these local authorities did report a higher rates of formal activity and a stronger strategic approach, there is evidence to suggest there's certain limitations and challenges associated with this style of enforcement. So, for example, coercive instruments require substantial resources to be effective, and as a result of resource constraints, most local authorities in this category felt they were barely scratching the surface. Underreporting of standards by tenants, finding tenants to testify was a key issue. Deterrence depends on there being sufficiently severe court sanctions, which is rarely the case. And there was evidence in our case studies to suggest that where inappropriately applied, it could breed resentment amongst the landlord community and could be counterproductive in undermining the goodwill of those that might be willing to comply. Our findings suggest that some local authorities and Rent Smart Wales were explicitly attempting to reach a synergy between punishment and persuasion and adopt what we've termed a compliance-focused approach. So here the focus is predominantly on informal activity, yet they are necessary to escalate the response if compliance is not forthcoming. But they very much emphasize sort of advice, assistance, support, cooperation. There was a range of compliance focused activities provided, sort of ranging from dedicated advisory functions, regular newsletters, free training, regular landlord forums, and generally there was a range of activities provided that were systematic, part of the strategic approach, targeted the sector at large. These areas generally had a large PRS, and there was a feeling that the sheer size of the sector made it necessary to focus on compliance-focused activity. Collaboration was seen as inherently more effective in achieving compliance than deterrence-focused approaches. Prosecutions weren't seen as a sign of success in and of themselves, and whilst many of these authorities did show sort of relatively high levels of formal activity, where it didn't occur, this was seen as a sign that less interventionist measures were working. The aim was very much to achieve compliance, and they seemed to view themselves as an educator. So as this participant said, we're very strong in compliance. Our role was mainly to educate and help landlords. Rather than working against landlords, we try to work with them. So these local authorities did appear to be adopting the principles of responsive regulation and as a means of combining both compliance and deterrence approaches to regulation. So the advice and information, other informal activity was adopted as a strategy of first choice, and the response was then escalated if compliance was not forthcoming. And it was reported, whilst informal activity was rarely analysed, we were provided with evidence from Rent Smart Wales and some local authorities that informal activity could be effective with some certain types of landlords, and the fact that they rarely had to escalate the response was taken as evidence that these approaches were working. However, responsive regulation was only occasionally adopted as part of a strategic approach, so the principles were applied in practice, but we only identified an example of one local authority showing a graded response to enforcement being explicitly outlined within their enforcement strategy, clearly communicated to the sector. And what the consequence of not having it adopted at a strategic level is that it can lead to inconsistent application of the law, particularly in regards to escalation and de-escalation. Our findings also suggest that some local authorities in the sector are adopting new or creative approaches to enforcement. So these strategies aren't mutually exclusive from those that I've already discussed. Some preferred more hardline approaches, some focused more on compliance-focused mechanisms, but they were unique in their adoption of alternative regulatory techniques and their understanding of the problem, so a different understanding of the problem. So whilst most local authorities are focused on standards and regulating landlords' behaviour, these local authorities situated the needs of renters, of tenants at the heart of their strategy, tended to be an area-based strategy that was focused on strong partnership working with lots of different sort of public services in order to identify issues and respond to them. So there was new models of integrated service delivery developed with various public services co-located under one sort of umbrella. There was when officers would carry out inspections, it wasn't just about applying the law, it was about meeting with the tenants, identifying any issues, improving referral and signposting pathways. The staff would get training from different organisations so they could better identify and respond to issues. So it was very much about adopting a more holistic perspective, also focusing on homelessness prevention, adopting a more systems-based approach where sort of poor standards were seen as a more complex reality, with issues relating to poverty and deprivation and tenant vulnerability comprising a key part. As this one participant from a creative authority told us, it's not just about the housing, it's about the people, it's about the health wrapping around everything. So when the staff go in there, they try to identify the different issues, what's broken, what needs fixing, do you have the right benefits, do you need a dentist, so much more than just housing standards. So these local authorities demonstrate the benefits of approaching PRS issues and issues relating to standards in the sectors in a more holistic manner. So there's a population now living in the sector that would have previously perhaps been able to access social housing, and a widely recognised phenomenon is that housing issues often co-occur alongside other issues, for example, relating to benefits or debt or relationship breakdown. So the adoption of a more holistic approach allows sort of the needs of vulnerable renters to be identified and addressed by building new strategic partnerships. These local authorities also allowed us to consider issues of regulation in the sector beyond the compliance and deterrence dichotomy, and they allow us to think about, well, perhaps a more positive way forward is not about sort of when are formal penalties applied and not applied, but what are other issues relating to regulatory technique that we need to think about. So, what is the aim and purpose of the strategy? How are outcomes understood, defined, and measured? What role do other organisations have to play within all of this? What's our understanding of the problem? Does it capture all relevant dimensions? Is our response complex enough to respond to the complex nature of the problem which we're experiencing? It is important to mention, however, that building and maintaining effective multi-agency arrangements does require a sophisticated set of leadership and organisational skills. So the findings show that there are limits to what enforced compliance mechanisms can offer, and that perhaps our ability to increase compliance and raise standards within the sector would be enhanced if we more closely considered the spontaneous factors, those factors on the kind of the left column of Parker and Nielsen's 14 compliance factors. And the findings suggest that focusing exclusively on formal enforcement overlooks some of the most important aspects of the work of local authorities. Certain characteristics of the PRS, so the level of inadvertent non-compliance, the level of amateurism within the sector, suggests that these less interventionist measures might often be preferable. Of course, however, they must operate within the shadow of the law. Formal enforcement has to be offered as a viable alternative. And the literature does suggest that using multiple rather than single policy instruments usually produces more effective results. So perhaps there is scope to explore this principle in more depth in relation to the private rented sector. That all being said, a blend of different enforcement strategies is costly. Local authorities are already currently facing the challenge of meeting increased demand with diminishing resources, and services do require adequate funding to develop appropriate and effective responses to the changing nature and context of the sector. In our report, which will be published hopefully next month, there'll be a series of recommendations for policy and practice, so do look out for that. And if you're interested, do look on our website for other research reports that we're putting out as part of this 3-year-long research programme, which is aiming to improve conditions and standards in the sector. Thank you for listening.